the fighter ace who refused to die, an impossible, unbelievable survival that shocked the world. On March 5, 1944, a 21-year-old pilot was flying over France when German bullets ripped through his cockpit and set his plane on fire. He had two choices: stay in the burning aircraft and die, or jump out over Nazi-occupied territory with almost zero chance of survival. What he did next would save his life. But the real story is what happened after he made it back. This is the story of Chuck Yeager. You probably know him as the guy who broke the sound barrier, the test pilot, the legend. But before all that, he was just a kid from West Virginia who couldn't even afford college. And in 1944, he found himself in a situation that would have killed most men twice over. This isn't just about one dramatic moment, though. This is about how someone with everything stacked against them became one of the greatest fighter pilots in history. And trust me, the way he did it is not what you'd expect. Let's go back to the beginning. Charles Elwood Yeager was born in 1923 in Myra, West Virginia. And when I say his family didn't have money, I mean they really didn't have money. His dad worked in the gas fields. They lived in a small town where nothing ever happened. College wasn't even a conversation in his house because there was no way they could afford it. When World War II started heating up, Yeager was 18 years old. He knew he needed to do something with his life. The military seemed like the only way out. So in September 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces as an aircraft mechanic. Not a pilot, a mechanic. Because back then, you needed at least 2 years of college to become a pilot, and Yeager didn't have that. But here's the thing about Yeager. He had this gift. People who knew him said he could look at a machine and just understand how it worked. He had these hands that could fix anything. More importantly, he had eyesight that was off the charts. We're talking 20/10 vision. He could see things in the sky before anyone else could. And he had this weird ability to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. In 1942, the Army changed the rules. They opened up a new program that let enlisted men become pilots even without college degrees. Yeager jumped on it immediately. He went through training at multiple bases across the United States, and in March 1943, he got his wings. They sent him to Europe. He was assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron, part of the 357th Fighter Group. His plane was a P-51 Mustang, one of the best fighters America ever built. He named it Glamorous Glenn after his girlfriend back home, Glenny's Faye Dickhouse. Now, being a fighter pilot in 1943 and 1944 wasn't like playing a video game. The life expectancy for these guys was measured in missions, not years. Every time you took off, there was a real chance you weren't coming back. The skies over Europe were absolutely filled with German fighters. The Luftwaffe had experienced pilots who'd been fighting since 1939, and they had good planes too. The Focke-Wulf 190, the Messerschmitt 109. These weren't jokes. Yeager flew his first combat mission on February 4, 1944. He was nervous, obviously, but he got through it. He flew more missions throughout February. On March 4th, he shot down his first enemy aircraft, a German bomber. He was starting to get the hang of it, but the very next day, March 5th, everything went wrong. The mission that day was an escort run. American bombers were hitting targets deep inside France, and the fighters had to protect them from German interceptors. Yeager was flying his P-51 over southwestern France, near the border with Spain. The sky was a mess. Dogfights were breaking out everywhere. Planes were spinning, diving, firing. Yeager got separated from his squadron in the chaos. Then he saw it, a German Focke-Wulf 190 right in front of him. He moved in to attack, but what he didn't see was another German fighter coming up behind him. The German pilot opened fire and Yeager's plane got hit hard. The bullets smashed through the cockpit and into the engine. Pieces of metal were flying everywhere. His instrument panel exploded. And then the worst part, the plane caught fire. When your plane catches fire at 20,000 feet, you have seconds to make a decision. Not minutes, seconds. The fire spreads fast. The smoke fills the cockpit. You can't breathe. You can't see. And if the fuel tank goes, you're just gone. Yeager knew he had to get out. He rolled the plane over, popped the canopy, and bilayed out. The parachute opened. That was the good news. The bad news: he was falling right into Nazi-occupied France, and it gets worse. When he hit the ground, he landed hard in a forest. Really hard. He injured his back and his knee. He could barely walk. He gathered up his parachute and tried to figure out what to do next. He was alone, injured in enemy territory with no supplies, no map, and no way to contact anyone. The Germans were looking for downed pilots. If they found him, his war was over. He'd spend the rest of the conflict in a prison camp, if he was lucky. If he wasn't lucky, well, the SS didn't always follow the rules about how to treat captured airmen. Yeager started moving. He didn't know where he was going exactly, just away from where he'd landed. He walked through the forest for hours, trying to stay hidden. His back was killing him. His knee was swelling up. Night was coming and it was getting cold. He found a spot under some trees and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. He kept thinking about the Germans patrolling nearby. The next morning he started walking again. He was hungry, thirsty, and in pain. Then he heard voices. French voices. He stayed hidden at first because he didn't know who he could trust. There were collaborators all over France, French people who worked with the Nazis. If he approached the wrong person, they'd turn him in immediately. But he didn't have a choice. He needed help. He revealed himself to a group of French civilians. And this is where Yeager got incredibly lucky. These people were part of the French resistance. They hated the Nazis, and they had an entire network set up to help downed Allied airmen escape back to England. They took Yeager in, gave him food and civilian clothes, and hid him in a safe house. But he wasn't safe yet. Not even close. The resistance told him they were going to move him along an escape route that went through the Pyrenees mountains into Spain. Spain was neutral, which meant once he got there, he could make his way to the British embassy and get sent back to England. But here's the problem. The Pyrenees aren't just hills. These are serious mountains. The route went up to 8,000 feet in elevation, in winter, with snow and ice, and German patrols on the French side and Spanish border guards on the other side who might or might not shoot you. Oh. And remember, Yeager's back and knee were still messed up from the parachute landing. The resistance moved him from safe house to safe house over the next few weeks. He stayed in barns, basements, attics. He met other downed airmen who were also trying to escape. One of them was a guy who'd been shot in the leg and could barely walk. The resistance fighters were risking their lives every single day to help these Allied pilots. If the Germans caught them, they'd be tortured and executed. But they did it anyway. Finally, in late March, the resistance told Yeager it was time to cross the mountains. They gave him a guide, a Basque man who knew the routes through the Pyrenees like the back of his hand. They started climbing at night to avoid patrols. It was freezing. The wind was brutal. The paths were narrow and icy. One wrong step and you'd fall hundreds of feet. Yeager's injuries were slowing him down. The other wounded airman was in even worse shape. At one point, the guy just couldn't go any further. He was done. Yeager and the guide had to practically carry him. They climbed for hours in the dark, stopping whenever they heard something that might be a patrol. The altitude made it hard to breathe. Yeager's knee felt like it was going to give out completely. But somehow they made it over. They crossed into Spain. They made contact with people who got them to the British embassy in Madrid. From there, the British sent them back to England. Yeager had been behind enemy lines for almost a month. Most guys in his situation never made it back, but he did. Now here's where the story takes a turn. When Yeager got back to England, the army had a rule. If you'd been shot down and helped by the resistance, you weren't allowed to fly combat missions anymore. The reason was simple. If you got shot down again and captured, the Germans would torture you to get information about the resistance network. They'd make you give up names, locations, everything. And that would get a lot of brave people killed. Yeager was told his war was over. They were going to send him back to the United States to be a flight instructor. He'd train other pilots, but he wouldn't see combat again. And Yeager said no. He didn't go through all that, didn't survive getting shot down, didn't climb over mountains with broken bones just to sit out the rest of the war. He wanted to fly. He wanted to fight. So he did something that most people wouldn't even think of. He went straight to the top. He requested a meeting with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, the guy in charge of everything. Somehow, Yeager got the meeting. He stood there in front of Eisenhower and made his case. He said he understood the risk. He said he wouldn't give up the resistance if he got captured again. He said the Army had trained him to be a fighter pilot and that's what he wanted to do, send him back up. And Eisenhower, for whatever reason, agreed. He made an exception. Yeager was cleared to fly combat missions again. So Yeager went back to his squadron, and this is where he became a legend. On October 12, 1944, Yeager was flying an escort mission for bombers attacking Dresden and Bremen in Germany. The Luftwaffe came up to defend. A huge air battle broke out, and in that single mission, Yeager shot down 5 German planes. 5. In one day. That made him an ace in one mission, which was incredibly rare. But it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about how he did it. Other pilots who flew with Yeager said he had this ability to see the battle in a way that nobody else could. He'd spot enemy planes before they even showed up on anyone else's radar. He could predict what they were going to do. He understood angles, speeds, energy management, all this stuff that most pilots had to think about consciously. For Yeager, it was instinct. He kept flying missions through the fall and winter of 1944. By the end of the war in Europe, he'd officially shot down 11.5 enemy aircraft. The half came from a plane he shared the kill on with another pilot. But some people said his actual number was higher because not all his kills could be confirmed. There's one story from November 1944 that really shows who Yeager was. He was flying a mission when he spotted a German Me-262. This was the first operational jet fighter in history. It was faster than anything the Allies had. Most pilots were scared of the 262 because it could just blow past you, and there was nothing you could do about it. Yeager saw it on the ground, taxiing out for takeoff. He dove down and attacked it before it could get airborne. He destroyed it while it was still on the runway. When he got back, some people said that wasn't sporting, that you should let the enemy get in the air before you attack. Yeager's response was basically, "This is war, not a game. If I can destroy an enemy plane before it kills one of our bombers, I'm going to do it." That was his attitude about everything. Practical, direct, no nonsense. He wasn't flying for glory or to be a hero. He was flying to win. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Yeager had established himself as one of the best fighter pilots in the American military. But his story was just getting started. After the war, he became a test pilot. And that's when he'd do the thing that made him famous. On October 14, 1947, Yeager climbed into an experimental rocket plane called the X-1. The goal was to break the sound barrier, to fly faster than the speed of sound. A lot of scientists thought it might not be possible. Some thought the plane would just disintegrate if it got too close to the sound barrier. People called it the wall because planes would start shaking violently when they approached it, and pilots would lose control. Oh, and by the way, Yeager had broken 2 ribs in a horse riding accident 2 days before the flight. He didn't tell anyone because he didn't want to get pulled from the mission. He was in so much pain he couldn't close the door of the X-1 by himself. He had to use a broom handle to lever it shut. He took off. The B-29 bomber carrying the X-1 climbed to altitude, then dropped it. Yeager fired the rockets. The plane accelerated. It started shaking. The instruments went crazy. But Yeager stayed calm, just like he'd done over France in 1944. He pushed through. And at 45,000 feet, flying at 700 miles per hour, the X-1 broke the sound barrier. The shaking stopped. Everything smoothed out. Yeager had done it. He became the first human being to fly faster than sound. The achievement was kept secret for a while, but when it was finally announced, Yeager became a national hero. He got awards, medals, promotions. He kept test flying throughout the 1950s and 60s. He flew over 200 different types of aircraft. He trained astronauts. He served in Vietnam. He retired from the Air Force in 1975 as a brigadier general. But here's what's interesting about Yeager. Even with all that fame, all those accomplishments, he never really changed who he was. He was still that kid from West Virginia. He still talked with his accent. He was blunt, sometimes too blunt. He didn't sugarcoat things. If he thought you were wrong, he'd tell you. Some people didn't like that about him, but the people who flew with him respected it because they knew he was honest. There are all these stories about Yeager from after the war. Like the time in the 1980s when an aviation writer said that Yeager's autobiography exaggerated some of his war accomplishments. Yeager was in his 60s at this point, but he still challenged the guy to a fistfight. That's who he was. Or the time he went back to France decades later and met some of the resistance fighters who'd saved his life in 1944. He never forgot what they did for him. These were farmers, teachers, ordinary people who risked everything to help Allied airmen escape. Some of them had been caught and killed by the Germans. Yeager made sure people knew about their sacrifice. He stayed active well into old age. He kept flying. In 2012, on the 65th anniversary of breaking the sound barrier, Yeager went up in an F-15 Eagle at age 89. He was still doing it. In 2017, at age 94, he announced he was finally done with flying. His body just couldn't handle it anymore. Chuck Yeager died on December 7, 2020, at age 97. By that time, he'd lived through almost the entire history of powered flight. When he was born in 1923, airplanes had only existed for 20 years. When he died, we had stealth fighters, drones, spacecraft. He'd seen it all, and he'd been a part of pushing the boundaries of what was possible. So what do you take from a story like this? Here's a guy who had no money, no connections, no college education. He could have just stayed in West Virginia and worked in the gas fields like his dad. Nobody would have blamed him, but he didn't. He saw an opportunity with the Army Air Forces and took it. When they told him he couldn't be a pilot because he didn't have a degree, he waited until the rules changed and then jumped on it. When he got shot down over France, he didn't give up. He survived, escaped, climbed over mountains with broken bones and made it back. When they told him his war was over, he went to the top guy and convinced him otherwise. When they told him the sound barrier might be impossible to break, he broke it anyway, with broken ribs. That's not just talent. Yeager had talent, sure. The eyesight, the instincts, the mechanical ability. But a lot of people have talent and don't do anything with it. What Yeager had was something else. He had this absolute refusal to accept limits. When someone told him he couldn't do something, that just made him want to do it more. And he wasn't reckless, that's important. He wasn't some daredevil taking stupid chances. He was calculated, he understood the risks, he prepared. When he flew, he knew his aircraft inside and out because he'd taken them apart and put them back together as a mechanic. When he broke the sound barrier with broken ribs, he'd already planned for what would happen if he couldn't use his arms properly. He used the broom handle to close the door. That's not recklessness. That's determination combined with intelligence. The other thing about Yeager is he never forgot where he came from. He became famous, got to meet presidents, became a general. But he was still the guy from Myra, West Virginia. He didn't put on airs. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. And he never forgot the people who helped him, like the French resistance fighters. He could have just moved on with his life after the war and never thought about them again. But he didn't. He made sure their story was told. There's something about that generation that's worth thinking about. These were people who grew up in the Great Depression. They had nothing. Then World War II started and they had to go fight. They were just kids. Yeager was 21 when he got shot down. 21. Most 21-year-olds today are in college worrying about exams. These guys were over Europe getting shot at by German aces. And they did it. They won the war. Then they came home and built the modern world. The interstate highways, the suburbs, the space program, all of it. Yeager lived long enough to see all of that. He saw his grandkids grow up in a world that was completely different from the one he'd grown up in. A world that was safer, more prosperous, more advanced. And he was a part of making that happen. Not just through breaking the sound barrier, but through everything he did. Every mission he flew over Europe was part of defeating Nazi Germany. Every test flight he did was part of pushing aviation forward. It all mattered. When you look at the big picture of his life, what's crazy is how much of it came down to moments where he could have quit but didn't. If he'd stayed in the burning plane over France instead of bailing out, he's dead. If he'd gotten caught by the Germans after landing, he's a prisoner. If he'd broken his ankle in the mountains instead of just injuring his knee, he probably doesn't make it over. If he'd accepted the decision to pull him from combat after his escape, he doesn't become an ace. If he'd told someone about his broken ribs before the X-1 flight, they would have scratched him, and someone else would have been the first to break the sound barrier. Any one of those moments goes differently, and you've never heard of Chuck Yeager, but they didn't go differently. He made choices. He kept pushing, and that's why we're talking about him now. The P-51 Mustang he flew, Glamorous Glenn, that plane was eventually lost, but there are other P-51s in museums now painted with his markings. You can go see them. You can see the X-1 he flew at the Smithsonian. These machines are pieces of history, but they're also reminders of what people are capable of when they refuse to give up. Yeager's story isn't just about flying. It's about taking whatever hand you're dealt and making the most of it. It's about seeing an opportunity and grabbing it. It's about when things go wrong, which they will, you figure it out. You don't sit there and complain. You don't make excuses. You do what needs to be done. That's the real lesson here. Not everyone's going to break the sound barrier. Not everyone's going to be a fighter ace. Most of us are never going to fly a plane at all, but everyone faces moments where they have a choice. Keep going or give up, push through or quit, take the risk or play it safe. Those moments define who you are. Yeager faced those moments over and over, and he kept choosing to push through. Even when he was old, when his body was failing, he kept flying until he physically couldn't anymore. That's who he was until the very end. The kid from West Virginia, who became one of the greatest pilots who ever lived. Who got shot down over France and made it back. Who climbed mountains with broken bones. Who looked at the sound barrier and said, "Let's see what happens." Who lived 97 years and packed more into that time than most people could in 5 lifetimes. That's Chuck Yeager, and that's why his story still matters today. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this.